Thanks again to Lou and HomeWise CEO Mike Lofton for the interview. Now we return to the roundtable for one last conversation about Bill Richardson. Looking broadly past his work as governor, Richardson went from being derided in the 1980s as a carpetbagger with roots in Mexico and California to becoming the face of politics in New Mexico. Here he's a fluent Spanish speaker, a high-profile Hispanic politician at a time when there weren't nearly as many as there are now. But how did Richardson's time in the national spotlight, whether as governor or United Nations ambassador or energy secretary, shape the way people outside of our state think of New Mexico? I'll start with you, Diane. You talked about seeing him grumpled when he was running for office as a congressman in the 1980s there in northern New Mexico, to becoming somebody on the national stage. And it was relatively unique because he was not from here. And as we said, we privileged the people that liked the Isequias and played basketball. How did he be able to accomplish this?
Well, I think you just glossed over the fact that he spoke Spanish. I think when I saw him in northern New Mexico and southern New Mexico in little pocket communities, Bill Richardson always, he knew when he could speak Spanish. And frankly, a lot of people weren't so aware of his background. They didn't pay much attention to the carpetbagger, the political words that were used many times in the arena. But having spoken to many people this week since his death, everybody has a story about Bill Richardson. And that tells you something about the kind of retail political guy he was. One person told me that, after Bill Richardson came to New Mexico and after he was governor, the weatherman quit standing in front of New Mexico on the map. And they always moved over, and New Mexico was on the map. And I thought that was a really cute interpretation of his influence on putting us on the map. So I think he did. And when I was first lieutenant governor, he brought the North Koreans, and he invited me to dinner with them, to their surprise and certainly to my surprise. And he had a really broad open door, and he would bring not just expert policy people around him, but the fourth floor just really lit up a lot with movie stars like Shirley MacLaine and Gene Hackman and Sean Penn and all these people that came up. And Sean Penn and Redford had different agendas, the environment, world peace. But he never shut any policy discussions out, even if they weren't locally based.
And on that note, Steve, what about here at home? I mean, he was different from anybody who preceded him or succeeded him here as governor. He was ambitious from the start. When he ran for president, he had a huge personality, a governor style, and it affected the way New Mexicans thought about him. What kind of politician did he become? Was it transforming? Was it evolving? What did you see in covering him?
Well, actually, I think even though their styles are different, I see a lot of Bruce King in Richardson. A big guy who goes in the room, knows everybody. How's your mom? How's your brother?
He might not have liked that if you told him that to his face.
Yeah, he might not have. He might argue with me on that, but it's true, Bill. You're talking about the carpetbagger stuff. I think he shook that fairly early in his career. He had so many town halls throughout northern New Mexico when he was in Congress. And I covered a few of those. I didn't really cover Congress a lot back then, but every one time I went, he knew people, and not just the bigwigs, not just the political leaders. He knew farmers and ranchers and workers. He seemed to take a personal interest in them, and he listened to them, and I think that's how he came off. He was a transformational politician. He got a lot of stuff done that no one would dream of. And we talk about the rail runner and the spaceport. Those are big accomplishments. But I think even bigger was the film industry, like we discussed a little bit earlier. I think that had more lasting impact than the spaceport or any of them.
And Martha, how was he viewed nationally?
I beg your pardon?
How was he viewed nationally?
Well, he was viewed positively for the most part. He had his detractors, of course, and politics then, it's hard to imagine because they're so bitter now. but people were still polite to one another for the most part. And so even if they didn't agree with him, they respected what he could do and had done, and his potential, I think, as well. So I think in that department, he was pretty solidly entrenched with not only the constituents, but with the colleagues. He'd been in Congress, obviously. He had all of those contacts, and I think he was still very well regarded.
And yet there were also plenty of contradictions to Bill Richardson. He was a champion for women's issues. We talked about the pay equity thing that he was able to get through. Yet his name turned up in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. He sprung journalists out of foreign prisons, and yet he could be elusive and thorny with the local press. How do we negotiate that?
Carefully. But I think most of the members of the press knew his ups and downs, would you say, or quirks, how to sort of relate to him. That was true in my role as well. It was strictly professional. We were not colleagues outside of the work. We were not personal friends, although we were always cordial. And I think you just had to realize his the depth he had and the different kinds of ways you might have to interact with him depending on the subject, depending on the time. He was very time sensitive. He wanted you to get to the point. And it just took a little bit of thinking carefully before you ever got with him. What is your goal here? How can you accomplish it? Knowing his depth of knowledge, which was considerable on many things, and knowing his personal style.
And still pay equity. You still think that's a great accomplishment?
I know it is. It was a first in the nation initiative, and I have to say it was so disappointing, and I know Diane would share this, that a woman governor that followed him killed it. It was the first initiative in the nation, first of all, to study our own pay equity in the state workforce, and it was quite a good report. We were doing very well. But this was to have any contractor that wanted a contract with the state of New Mexico to tell us how they were paying women and how they were paying men, because that's taxpayer money, and we had a right to know. Not anybody's salary on a bulletin board, just aggregate data. And it was a model effort, and as I said, first in the nation, and it had the potential for national replication, and when Martinez came in, it all went away.
And Diane, he helped negotiate the release of Americans held in captive in places like North Korea, Sudan, Iraq, Cuba, and just last year he played a part in bringing U.S. Women's basketball player Brittany Griner back from detention in Moscow. He liked the term freelance negotiator, and he had some real successes in spots where the government had failed. How did his personality lend itself to that work? And where does his death leave the void in this corner of international relations? We don't have a governor who have these skills like that. What do we lose?
Well, I think what we lost was somebody who had the true interest of the families. A lot of times, and I think that's where Bill became a rogue or a freelance negotiator, was he wanted to help those families be reunited. That was his strength. The Pentagon, other negotiators, they have other interests at heart, how the president looks, those kind of things. I'll tell you a cute story. I saw him at something when the Brittany Griner first happened, and I said, "Are you going to get Brittany Griner out?" And he said, "Well, I've got a little competition for that." And I said, "Who would that be?" And he said, "Joe Biden." And he said, "You know, he wants the credit." And I said, "I'm going to tell you the lesson I learned under you. He's the president. You do the work. He gets the credit. That's how it goes." And we laughed about that. And he said, "Is that true?" And I said, "That's right." I said, "You'll get your share of the credit, Governor. Just do the best you can to bring her home."
Oh. Let's go around the table one more time. If Richardson were sitting here, Steve, right now, what would he say he was most proud of during his time in public office, if you could get him to be honest?
Well, I think he'd probably have about 35 items he would list.
And get mad if he didn't have the time to mention them all, right?
Yeah. And so I think, I think he just lists all the things we've talked about, and probably more than we hadn't thought of.
Martha, what do you think he would be proud of?
I think he'd be proud of the gender parity in his administration. One of the first things he looked at after I went to work with him was how are women and men being paid in this administration? And he always had an eye on gender equity. He had so many other things going on that I don't know that it was at the top of the list, but it was always in that list.
Diane, there were many things. Reforming Department of Ed.
The Department of Ed, but I think one of the things that I have to mention is when I became Lieutenant Governor and I wanted to work on early childhood, he gave me the resources and the staff and the expertise around me to make sure that we could do everything possible for kids 0 to 5. And even after he kept pushing me to say, you should get more credit for that. You should get more credit for that. And I said, Governor, I never could have done it without you. So I want to say not just pay equity, but hiring women and supporting them and helping them be successful would be one of his accomplishments. I happen to think the film industry is probably, when he talks about his policy initiatives, I think it created so many jobs. It's had so much longevity. I think he would really focus on that as being something he did for New Mexico to diversify our economy.
You know, when he released his memoir, he told me, I asked him, did he have any regrets? And he told me, yes, I do. I should have told my father I loved him. And he said, I never had that chance.
I would like to second what you said about being given the resources to do what needed to be done. You didn't have to go beg. You didn't have to say, I need more money, I need more staff. He would say, what do you need?
No.
At the end of in the second administration, over 50% of the cabinet secretaries were women in Bill Richardson's administration, and they all knew what they were doing, and he didn't treat them any differently than he did the men. If they messed up, as we know from the current governor, he said, you're out of here, you know. So he was an equal opportunity employer.
Well, thanks again to Diane Denich, former Lieutenant Governor, Martha Burke, author and podcast host, and Steve Terrell, the legendary reporter at the Santa Fe, New Mexican, now retired. Thank you all.